Hello, I'm Globalist Editor Alex Stonehill, and we're here live chatting with Marwa Maziad, who's a columnist at the Egyptian newspaper Almasry Alyoum, and she's a specialist in Middle East media and politics and is currently a visiting researcher at Istanbul Şehir University. She also has a master's from the University of Washington's Department of Communication, where the Globalist is located. Thank you so much for joining us, Marwa.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So these protests that started in late May were initially all about stopping the development of a park in Istanbul, but they've really expanded from there. Can you tell us kind of what the protests are all about?
Yes. So as you say, it started out being about the development project, but then a mechanism kicked in where anti-government generalized grievances took place, and that rallied a lot of people together in other parts of the city and other cities in Istanbul as well. I can hear myself. Is that normal?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. If you could take
Okay.
the headphones out when you're talking, if that's easier. So can you tell us what the latest news is from Istanbul when it comes to the protests? Have things kind of settled down a little bit?
Well, things have settled down, so there isn't much of protest right now, but it took another form where instead of violently protesting or peacefully protesting, now there are forums taking place in different parts of the city. There is what became a phenomena of the standing man, Duran Adam, where a man started standing after the square was evacuated for 8 hours straight, and he was a performance artist. And then people started following that in different parts of the city as well. So I think the movement is taking new shapes where creativity and expression is manifesting itself differently right now.
And have the demands of these protests sort of shifted since they first started, or what are people hoping for? What do people want?
Well, I think, as you said, it started out as a call for participatory democracy, where the people wanted to have a say in the way their city is being developed. And I think Erdogan was he was delayed in his reaction, so that was not very smart at the get-go. He ignored the protests for a few days, especially that he was traveling.
You're talking about the Turkish prime minister there.
The Turkish prime minister. Yeah. But then I would have to highlight that he took a smart route where he started talking about institutions where the demands would be met through the two institutions, the courts. He said, well, if you have issues with the city that voted on this development project, then, well, go to court. And even if my government wins the case, then we'll have a referendum on it. So I think by evoking political institutions, namely the court system and the referendum mechanism, he knew how to deflate the crisis, the immediate crisis, and then said, then he's now showing responsiveness to the initial protesters. Now that left the other protesters that had generalized grievances against him, against his authoritarian style, quote unquote, or a bunch of laws that have been passed lately regarding women abortion rights, regarding the consumption of alcohol. So where the Turkish people started feeling that he's encroaching on their lifestyle preferences, that became kind of relegated. And therefore, I think he addressed the initial source of conflict, and that kind of now at least people are waiting for the outcome of these two mechanisms, namely the court system and the referendum.
So when the protests first started, I think for a lot of people, the view from Seattle might have looked a lot like are these similar to the protests that overthrew governments in Egypt or in Libya and Tunisia? But you were quick to point out, you have a lot of expertise in both Turkish politics and in Egyptian politics, and you were quick to point out that you really didn't think that was the case, and it wasn't going to turn into a sort of Arab Spring style entire overthrow of the government. Tell me more about that.
Yes, I wrote a column for Aljazeera English about, I called it From Tahrir to Taksim, and I was quick to say this is not a revolution for those who are pushing for a so-called Arab Spring in Turkey. The reason why I'm saying that is that, first of all, I'm not going to delineate all the differences between Turkey and some of the Arab countries, but I want to highlight the circumstance. I think what is happening in Turkey is almost similar to what started happening in Egypt in the early 2000s, meaning Mubarak has been at the time 20 years into power, one term after the other. He was going through elections, after all. He had built bases of people who supported his regime because they were benefiting. And throughout the 2000s, like from 2000, 2003, 2005, 2007, there had been a series of protests going on against his authoritarianism and also the project of inheritance. The idea that his son Gamal Mubarak was supposed to take it over from his dad. Now, I compare that moment to the Turkish moment, not the 2011 Egyptian moment of revolution, meaning that the Turkish people now are giving the siren off to Erdogan. Do not have these grand plans of running for presidency after you change the constitution to have a couple more terms. Do not go into this authoritarian, majoritarian democracy style governance where if I have 50%, then I can do whatever I want. Do not do these things, because if you continue to do that, maybe it won't even be 10 years. Maybe it will be a few years before we have an outright revolution. So that's why I was saying that the moment is not the moment of 2011 for Egypt, where mobilization has been happening already for over 10 years in Egypt before we reached 2011. What I wanted to detect, though, is that there are similarities in the mechanism by which there are some mobilization strategies among those protesters. So in other words, if Erdogan is not very careful to understand that this is a serious siren, a wake-up call that you do not have grand plans of continuing forever and you have to change your leadership style, he might as well end up being in a revolution where, after all, I have to say, people were saying, and I heard it in the square, Tayyip istifa, which means resign. So that was one of the demands. People are already uttering go away, which is irhal in the Arabic context. So he shouldn't have taken that, he shouldn't take that easily. And I think he is aware. But amnesia, you might forget in a few years that had happened, which happened with Mubarak. So that's where there are differences. Turkey and Egypt might mirror each other, but they are not exactly exact mirror images. They are reflecting different phases in the development of politics there.
All right, we're talking with Marwa Maziad, from a columnist at an Egyptian newspaper and researcher at Istanbul Şehir newspaper, or sorry, Şehir University, about the protests in Istanbul. And you can tweet questions for Marwa at Seattle Globalist. Just tag at Seattle Globalist on Twitter, and we'll read your question on the air here. So shifting gears a little bit to Egypt, we originally planned this chat to be about Turkey, but things have gotten interesting in Egypt again just in the last couple of days. This is the 1-year anniversary of the election of the Egyptian president, Mohamed Morsi, and there's been a lot of protest activity there as well, calling for him to resign only 1 year into his, I believe it's a 4-year term. What's going on there, and does this seriously threaten to oust him from power, do you think?
Well, what's happening in Egypt are people congregating again into Tahrir Square and other squares. June 30th is a big day, and it's coming very quickly. President Morsi gave a speech yesterday that all what I can say, I have a smile on my face, because it was, people really described it even almost as a farce, like absurd theatrics. He's exhibiting signs that he's very detached from what is really going on. There has been a social movement of signing called rebel or tamarrud, which means they want to really withdraw confidence from him. So there is a lot going on, and we are watching what will happen. I cannot entirely predict what will happen on June 30th, especially because I would say that the street politics, the idea of congregation of people on the street, mobilization to get them there, to have a demand, I think it was exhausted in Egypt for 3 years. So as a mechanism itself, it's hard to predict how efficient that will be. However, we don't know. It's a dynamic. So people are mobilizing. They will be in the street. They demand his resignation, or actually not resignation, a call for early elections, because the argument is that he failed during the first year, that's his anniversary, to achieve the revolution's demand. So we will see how that happens, but what happens with that. But I would just highlight for an American audience how much Egypt has a history of this kind of protest practice. In 1919, I think it was the first and almost the last movement where the Weft political party at the time was collecting sheets of paper from the people on the street that they were petitioning a call for independence from the British at the time. So now Egyptian youth are capitalizing on a very old tradition in our history. It goes back to 1919, where you sign those pieces of paper with name and ID and say, I participate in this and I don't want you as president anymore. If you can imagine that those young activists gathered 20 million signatures, pieces of paper with full information. People announced their information on this piece of paper in a couple of months. That tells you, that the argument that the Muslim Brotherhood, from which President Morsi has emerged, and his party, Freedom and Justice Party, they were always arguing that they were the ones really close to the street, that they can go to the level of the alley and mobilize and give services and rally support. Well, if you can get 20 million people to sign a piece of paper, then you've reached a lot of people. So he should be quite alarmed by that, but he seems not to be. So I don't know, we don't know for sure. Is that a tactic, or is he oblivious? So things will play out, but I'm watching, of course, very carefully how things are developing there. So
speaking of Morsi's party, between Egypt and Turkey, two of the sort of main powerhouse countries in the Middle East are run by Islamic parties now. Should that be cause for concern, or is this just sort of a manifestation of the political will of those people in those countries?
Well, I would have to correct you on the idea that Turkey and Egypt are run by Islamist parties, because Turkey is not run by an Islamist party. Erdogan and his party were very clear from the get-go to say, we are a secular party that is running in a secular state. I, Erdogan, happen to be a Muslim and a devout Muslim, but that doesn't mean I'm an Islamist or my party is. It's Islam-inspired, it has some references, but it's not an Islamist party. And actually, in Egypt, that's what most Egyptians had hoped, that the Freedom and Justice Party, Morsi's party, would become. But that did not happen. They did not make this important distance between them and religion in the state, and therefore alienated a lot of the non-Muslims. We have a 10% at least of Christian population in Egypt, the not religious Muslims, or the religious Muslims who call themselves liberal Muslims. So there are many sensibilities, but to not distinguish between the state and the expression of religion that was something that put the Muslim Brotherhood Party in a different position altogether from Turkey. So,
we're talking to Marwa Maziad, an Egyptian newspaper columnist, about the protests in Egypt and in Turkey. So there's been a lot of unrest, obviously, in the Middle East in recent years. Do you see this as a positive trajectory overall, where the region is moving towards democracy, or is it moving towards chaos, as it sometimes might appear?
No, I have to be honest with you. I don't think this is a positive trajectory. I was very optimistic, perhaps in 2011, because my argument was 0 points are very good points. If you're starting from scratch, you can write anything. You can write a new constitution. You can live in the now. You can. Egypt has been told as a nation burdened by its history. We've been in history books since the dawn of time, and maybe this kind of sense of we're just old nation was a burden. We wanted to live in today's world, and there was a lot of optimism. However, the way things unfolded, no one would tell you in Egypt right now that that's the positive outcome or trajectory. The idea that there is lack of governability at all, like, so down with Mubarak, then down with the interim military council, then now down with Morsi that is elected. It's kind of down with the next president, as if you're always saying down with. And that's very chaotic and anarchist even, and nobody would say that this is a positive outcome. However, we should continue to push for a positive outcome and see a possible good scenario out of all this mess. But as we speak, it's not. When you look at Tunisia and Libya and Egypt and Syria with the civil war there, that evokes the kind of creative chaos that Condoleezza Rice mentioned in 2005, and I guess people did not pay enough attention at the time, but that kind of creative chaos is not necessarily anything positive for the people who are living there and want order and safety and security in their society.
So turning our view a little closer to home here in Seattle, a lot of these protests we've seen across the Middle East and now even in Brazil are economically motivated, and the protesters talk a lot about, stagnation and lack of opportunities. I'm curious if why you think this kind of protest really hasn't happened in the United States, where there's some of the same issues. The middle class hasn't really seen a lot of growth in their share of the economy, and the lower class as well over the past several decades. Do you think there's potential for this kind of thing to start in the U.S.?
Well, didn't we have our potential of Occupy Wall Street and had that moment? But then it became a moment that was deflated for some reason. Maybe someone else can theorize a little bit about why Occupy movement just began and slept away. But I have an idea. I think this notion of the 99% versus the 1%, we're the 99% and we need things. I think that worked a little bit, especially within the circumstance of all these revolutions everywhere, and people expressed themselves and went and had sit-ins and all of that. But I think, and that's what we really feel, is that most Americans at a certain juncture, especially that the economy started slightly picking up, I think they were, okay, they said like, okay, well, maybe if I try harder with the system, with the regime as is, I will find a way out. So I think the slogan and the mobilization strategies of the movement at a certain point failed to continue to gravitate people, because I think the government also responded by showing just a little bit of hope. So if you hang in there, so I think people went back to their life as normal and working a little harder and trying to find that other job and going through the same practices they've always had. So we'll see if their economy takes another turn. Maybe something will simmer up again. But I think that's what happened in the U.S.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Marwa, for joining us. Hopefully you won't mind asking a couple of follow-up questions if we get them from our viewers. And we'll look forward to seeing you back in Seattle soon.